one of the greatest, ain't no debating on it. I'm still levitated, I'm heavily medicated. Ironic, I gave him love and they end up hating on me. She told me she loved me and she been waiting. Been fighting hard for your love and I'm running thin on my patience. Needing someone to hug, even took it back to the basics. You see what you got me out here doing? Might have threw me off, but can't nobody stop the movement. Let's go. Left foot, right foot, levitating. Pop stars, do a leap with the baby. I had to lace my shoes for all the blessings I was chasing. If I ever slip, I fall into a better situation. So catch up, go put some cheese on it, get out and get your bread up. They always leave when you fall, but you run together. Weight of the world on my shoulders, I kept my head up. Now baby, stand up, cause girl, you
want me, I want you, baby. My sugar boo, I'm levitating. The Milky Way, we're renegading. Yeah, 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 yeah. I got you, moonlight. You're my starlight. I need you all night. Come on, dance with me. I'm levitating. You, moonlight. You're my starlight. I need you all night. Come on, dance with me. I'm levitating. You can fly away with me tonight. So you can fly away with me tonight. Baby, let me take you for a ride. Yeah, 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 yeah. I'm levitating. You can fly away with me tonight. So you can fly away with me tonight. Baby, let me take you for a ride. Yeah, 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 yeah. My love is like a rocket, watch it blast off. And I'm feeling so electric, down to awesome. And even if I wanted to, I can't stop. Yeah, 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 yeah. My love is like a rocket, watch it blast off. And I'm feeling so electric, down to awesome. And even if I wanted to, I can't stop. Yeah, 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 yeah. You want me, I want you, baby. My sugar boo, I'm levitating. The Milky Way.
All right, welcome to Product Tank RVA. Travis, I'm going to turn the mic over to you.
All right. Hey, everybody. This is Product Tank RVA. This is our first event of the year. We're here with Phyllis. We're going to talk about imposter syndrome. We're all very excited about it. While you guys are coming online, there is an icebreaker here. It's a Jamboard. I'll post the link to the Jamboard in the chat for everybody. It's in there a couple times. Isaiah posted it a couple times. And the first thing is, when do you feel like an imposter? So add some notes there and think through, like, what makes you feel like an imposter? There's a lot of things for me, but I'd love to know what makes you guys feel like an imposter. While we're kind of waiting for other folks to join, a couple of other kind of little announcements from our side. The big one is that for all you Richmonders out there, this year will be the very first ever Richmond Product Conference. You're going to hear a lot more about this, but it was actually just announced literally 2 minutes ago by RVA Tech. The folks on this call have partners with RVA Tech to build the first ever product conference. It'll be in person, one-day event right here in Richmond, Virginia. It's going to be really cool, and I can speak for myself and everybody on the Product Tank team that we're super excited. But no less excited than we are for this event here. I've read Phyllis's book. If you haven't read it, I have to recommend it. It's called From Fraud to Freedom, and it's terrific. I'm sure she'll talk about it today. Last thing on the Jamboard, while you're adding stuff to the Jamboard there to say when you feel like an imposter, you may sometimes people's work networks don't allow public Jamboards. If this is the case, you can open incognito mode in Google Chrome, and it will you can use the Jamboard that way. So just copy paste that link and put it into an incognito Chrome page, and you'll be able to add stuff to it. All right, Phyllis, I'm excited to hand it over to you. I'm excited to hear what you have to say. If you guys have questions for Phyllis, there will be a Q&A session afterwards, and she may choose to answer some questions in real time. I'm not sure. Just post your questions in the chat. Also, you guys probably know Product Tank, we love to just chit chat while we're here. We can't have in-person events yet, or we can, but this is not an in-person event, but we like to get an in-person feel. So please talk about the event, ask questions, things that are inspiring or interesting to you. Just post them in the chat to the right of your screen there, and it brings us all a little sense of community. So with that, Phyllis, I'd love to hand it over to you. You hear a little bit about what you're bringing us today. And thanks so much for coming. We're really excited to talk to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. So for those who don't know, I'm Phyllis. I'm the author from Fraud to Freedom, which is a book on growing through self-doubt and imposter syndrome. I specifically use the phrasing of growing through and not overcoming because unfortunately, you never actually fully get over it. And if anything, I actually saw this on Twitter yesterday. Somebody says that it grows with you and you end up getting more imposter syndrome the higher you go in your career. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But I really appreciate y'all being here. And I wanted to discuss not all of them. You'd have to read the book for literally all of them. But the main solutions that I surface in my book that have research back behind them about how people experience imposter syndrome and how we can do better about managing it. I assumed that there was a relatively mixed bag of an audience here. I can get that assumption validated or invalidated as we go along, but for that reason, it's structured in 3 parts, which is, well, besides literally explaining the structure of the book, after that, the first part is about those who are interested in getting into product. Then the second part is about those who are in product and how they can manage imposter syndrome in a new role. And then the last part is directed towards people who are team leads or managers or directors and how they can help reports or mentees with imposter syndrome, because imposter syndrome is not a solo job, even though it feels like a very isolated experience. That's actually part of the problem. It feels like it happens in isolation and it's all in our heads, but there are environmental factors that contribute to it. And I think it's really important for managers and mentors and all of us as individuals to do what we can to create a better environment. So I'm going to share my screen if I have sharing permissions.
You bet.
We'll get into it. And then, yeah, plenty of time for Q&A. The Q&A is my favorite part because it helps me think more about the things that I've said. And it also helps me clarify because no one's going to get everything right on the first try. So I will share my screen. So yes, managing imposter syndrome. As I had mentioned, I'm very particular about the wording that I use around imposter syndrome. I try not to say overcoming or leaving behind or anything like that, because the introduction of my book discusses the fact that Michelle Obama, Simon Sinek, all types of people who are, perceived as being at the top of their career still experiencing imposter syndrome. And in part, some people, I've been asked about this, like, how can you possibly have imposter syndrome when it's that obvious that you're pretty successful and you're working hard, but that kind of just ties into the fallacy of believing that hard work and achievement is the thing that makes it go away, because it really is more about self-assessment rather than external accolades. And so the outline of the book, if you do or don't want to get it, it's literally $3 as an ebook, $21 as a paperback, but I'm happy to literally talk about any of its contents. It's not, there's no like walls here in terms of what it's structured in. And the outline is talking about imposter syndrome. Don't fake it until you make it. That's my favorite chapter. Chapter 3, Mythbusters, is do not fake it until you make it. I'm disgustingly surprised by how often that advice is given out because it literally perpetuates the exact problem that you're trying to solve. Letting go of perfectionism, asking questions, practicing positivity, embracing compliments, imposter syndrome and the intersection of race, imposter syndrome and the intersection of gender, imposter syndrome and being first gen. I'm a Black woman who is also first gen, so these were all very personal chapters for me. And then managing those with imposter syndrome and what company culture can do and playing a part in easing imposter syndrome at every level. So before we start, I know we had the jam board, but I took these statements that I feel will resonate. This is not to, if they don't resonate, I'm not trying to lead you into thinking that they do, but I want people to take a moment to kind of think about their own experience, your own experience, and how these statements relate to your own experience. So I'm afraid to ask questions and have everyone find out that I don't really know anything, which is why there's a whole chapter on asking questions, because this is something people struggle with a lot. I'm not smart enough for this. Whatever this is, whether it's the job, a specific specific assignment, etc. You can also interchange the word smart for a lot of things. I'm not confident enough for this. I'm not experienced enough for this. Whatever you think you have to have more of in order to be qualified for something that you're interested in, what is that not enough piece for you? Everyone expects me to know what I'm doing, but I still haven't figured it out. So given that this audience is specifically product managers, I tweaked the statements that I usually put at the beginning specific to things that I think resonate with product managers. And this is one that comes up a lot. Everyone expects me to know what I'm doing. I'm literally making decisions on behalf of other people. I was hired to make decisions on behalf of all the people here, but I don't even know what I'm doing. So how am I supposed to literally do my job if I'm still figuring out what my job is? I just got lucky. I don't know what these acronyms mean, but everyone else does. I don't think I should be here. This is, I think, an underrated trigger of imposter syndrome is acronyms. I think that whenever people experience acronyms, myself included, it feels like, oh, I should know what that is. That's why it's an acronym, because it's blatantly obvious. And one, it leads to ineffective communication because sometimes more than one thing can stand for an acronym. But also for people who are new or people who literally just forgot what an acronym means, or people who are switching over from a different team where the same acronym has a different meaning, this can be a really triggering experience in that it makes someone feel like, I don't know what I'm doing because I don't know what this singular acronym means. And tech/any given company has a lot of acronyms. At Redfin, we actually have a whole document of acronyms, and our CEO vehemently tells us to not use acronyms and just write them out. I don't have a background like these other people, and I need to make up for it. Product is a gnarly, ambiguous field that has a lot of different types of people from a lot of different types of background coming into it. So I very frequently hear people say, I don't have a CS degree, I don't have an engineering degree, I don't have an MBA, I don't come from this part of the country, I don't have this specific type of experience or internship, etc. And I constantly feel, even once they are in a product role, I constantly feel like I have to make up for the fact that I don't have this thing. So if any of these resonated, I think you're in the right place. They all personally resonate with me. I am afraid to ask questions and have people find out that I don't really know anything. I do often feel like I'm not as smart enough for something. I, as a product manager, feel like everyone expects me to know all the answers, and sometimes I don't have even half of the answers and have to figure them out. I do feel like I just got lucky, and I very much so do not know what certain acronyms mean. I don't think I'll ever be done learning what acronyms there are for everything under the sun. And I don't have a computer science degree, don't have an MBA, et cetera, as a product manager, and sometimes feel pressured to make up for that, whatever that means. So what exactly is imposter syndrome? I think this will probably end up being a whole nother book if I were to unpack it, but a lot of people like to call things imposter syndrome that aren't imposter syndrome. For example, someone will walk into a meeting and be nervous about the meeting and be like, I'm having imposter syndrome about this meeting. And it's like, that's not really what that is, but okay. And it ends up being synonymous with anything related to self-doubt or a lack of confidence. But specifically, the way that I've defined it, and I don't know if y'all know who Jason Knight is, but he has a podcast called One Night in Product. I highly suggest checking it out. And he interviewed me for that podcast, and I defined it as self-doubt that becomes attached to your identity. So I can doubt myself on a specific assignment, but it becomes imposter syndrome when I doubt whether I should be a product manager in the first place, or whether I should be at this company, or whether I should be in this industry, or whether I should be in this organization or in this leadership position. It's not just the one meeting or the one assignment or the one email that's going to have the entirety of imposter syndrome wrapped into it, though that's when it can come up. That's just self-doubt. But once it becomes a thing of, I can't write this email, so I shouldn't be here at all, that's when we're starting to talk about imposter syndrome. And it's in the name, starting to feel like an imposter. So self-doubt that inflates into an identity crisis. And it very much so feels like a crisis. So I took the statements that I had shown previously, I highlighted the parts that were specific to conflating it with your identity. So I'm afraid to ask questions. Reasonable. anxious, afraid. That makes sense. It can be stressful and kind of scary to ask questions, especially in a new environment or in large rooms. The part that becomes an especially large problem is because I'm afraid to ask questions, and in that situation, I'm afraid of what other people will think of me, because to me, I'm interpreting that as I don't really know anything. And I don't want other people to perceive the fact that I don't really know anything. So went from being, I'm scared about asking this individual question, to I'm scared about having my identity be questioned and exposed. I'm not smart enough for this. Smart is a label on yourself. Confident is a label on yourself. Experience is a label on yourself. And labels are tied to identities. If you identify as a smart person or accomplished person or experienced person, that's an identity. And when you say something like, or when I say something like, I'm not smart enough for this, I'm saying my identity and my experience and who I am as a person is not qualified or capable enough for this very specific situation. Everyone expects me to know what I'm doing, and I still haven't figured it out. This is just a true statement. It's okay if you haven't figured it out, but the underlying fear here is I haven't figured it out and I may never figure it out. And therefore all these people who have expectations of me and all these people that I'm responsible to, I will fail them. And that becomes an identity crisis. I just got lucky. Luck is a denial of all of the work and diligence that you put into whatever you're doing or have been anything that you've done to get to the point that you're at, and denying all of that by saying you're just lucky and completely ignoring your identity in this case. I don't know what these acronyms mean, but everyone else does. I shouldn't be here. A sense of belonging coming out of 3 letters on a screen in capital letters. I don't have a background like these other people and I need to make up for it. So feeling like your identity becomes a hindrance. So I reframed these statements. What would these statements look like if they didn't conflate with your identity? I don't know this. And these are literally bullet by bullet the same things. So I didn't put them side by side because it would be a lot to be on one screen, but they are the same statements. I don't know this. I should ask about it so that we can all be on the same page. It's very different from I'm afraid of asking questions because people understand that I actually don't know anything. There's a lot to learn here, but I will use my resources to understand it. Everyone expects me to know what I'm doing, and I will leverage their knowledge to figure it out. There's a degree of luck involved in every opportunity, and I'm proud of the work that I did to be prepared for it. I don't know what these acronyms mean, and I'm probably not the only one. We should clarify what we're discussing. And I don't have the background like these other people, and I'm excited to learn from our different perspectives. So this is a very different shift from I'm stuck and I'm ashamed and I should hide because of the way that I'm feeling to all of these things are opportunities to do something better and to learn as a person and to grow as a person. So for those who are trying to get into product from whatever background they're coming from, I often have conversations related to the job search and how imposter syndrome plays a part in that. So some people operate in extremes of limiting themselves to roles where they only meet 100% of qualifications or like a very strong majority of qualifications. I find that very difficult because I don't know if other people have noticed this, but job descriptions continue to get more and more inflated in terms of what the qualifications are that are required. So I'm kind of concerned for people who think that they need to meet literally every single requirement on a job description, because those are getting few and far between, even for people who are actually very qualified for the roles that these people are hiring for. Or there's just like the defeated mindset of, I don't qualify for anything, so I'm just gonna apply to literally everything, even things that I blatantly know I am not qualified for. So for example, I'm a PM and then I'm just like, VP of product, perfect, and then send in an application. That's still on the extreme end of not being able to analyze what my actual qualifications are, and kind of a defeatist way of just spraying and praying, basically. So the way that I like to think about applications is, one, not limiting myself to the things that I apply, that 100% of the job description applies to me, because those are really few and far between. And also looking at the whole application and recruiting process differently. So I think part of what was really hard for me is that I saw everything on a job description as like a critical need, a critical must. And if I don't meet it, then I'm just trash to be thrown into the wastebasket, and the recruiter or the hiring manager can focus on the people, the actual diamonds that they're looking for. And that's not the case. That was like a very binary way of looking at job descriptions. And what I came to realize is there are things that are very strong requirements in a job description. For example, if a company is working with a certain tool and they need people to be working with that certain tool, that's a strong requirement. However, it might say like 8 years of experience and you have 4 or 6 and you think, okay, it says 8, I can't go for this role. And in my experience and the experience of other people that I've seen, that's not the case. So for example, I have a friend who's 2 years into their PM role, who recently got into the final rounds with Amazon for a role that had a job description that said 6 years of experience. Had they taken that so sternly, they never would have gone for that role in the first place. And often I'll have people, recruiters or hiring managers, reach out to me and they'll send me a job description. They're like, we think you're perfect for this. And then I'll actually read the job description. I'm like, I don't even fit the qualifications that you say are here. And they're like, no, it's fine. It's fine. Like, you can disregard that because we understand your background and we think you're a good fit. So I had to realize that the job description is like an ideal list. There are parts that are requirements, but not the whole list is a requirement. And I shouldn't be self-rejecting or self-selecting out of those opportunities. I also started to realize that interviews are not make or break. There are human beings. Just a friendly reminder, human beings are people that interview you. And before I used to see it as like, oh, like this grandmaster wizard is gonna ask me questions. And like, if I pass the test, then maybe I'll be allowed the opportunity to work in this job. And I started to reframe that thinking to interviews or opportunities to see if we're a mutual good fit, which allowed me to ask a lot more questions to see if something was a good opportunity for me. But also I started to see them as networking opportunities as well, because at the end of the day, another person is on the other end of your interview. And just because something isn't a good fit at this time doesn't mean that it won't be a good fit forever. And maintaining those relationships with these people instead of feeling completely defeated if I get rejected or told that I'm not getting on to the next round. And then another part that I really benefited from is to realize that people that I find intimidating. So for example, I would look at a friend's resume and I'm like, oh my God, this person has like 2 MBAs and like 3 different degrees in engineering, and they're going for the same PM role that I am. Like, instead of using that as a moment of shame and feeling like, oh, I shouldn't be going for these opportunities because I'm not qualified as the next person, I started to see people who intimidate me as opportunities for mentoring and someone that I can learn from. So I'd ask them questions like, how's your experience played into the roles that you're going for, and what have you learned, and how does it add or not add? For example, with a lot of people I know with MBAs, I'm like, how has that played into your day-to-day? I did a coding boot camp. People will reach out to me and ask me like, how's that played into your day-to-day? So sometimes when you look at something, you're like, oh, I don't have this thing, and I feel bad about it. It can be like, I don't have this thing, but this person does. This would be a great way to ask them questions about how that's enhanced or changed their perspective in their experience. There's this, I religiously watch Simon Sinek YouTube videos, and he said that competition reveals our weaknesses. I think that that's a perspective that I find especially helpful. I don't want to say that like everyone in the world is your competition for a job, but at the end of the day, all these other people who are going for certain opportunities are people that you can learn from, and you don't have to feel like you have to like either push them out or push yourself out, and just see it as like a growing community. And I found the product community to be very supportive. So this is a quote from the book that says, what held them back from applying was not a mistaken perception about themselves, but a mistaken perception about the hiring process. So as I mentioned, job descriptions are honestly ideal lists. They're not strict requirements, and there are parts that are flexible and sometimes exaggerated. I've unfortunately seen job descriptions that ask for experience, more years of experience in a tool that hasn't even existed for as long as they're listing the requirement for experience. But in the case that things can be more flexible depending on who you know, that's what happened. I work at Redfin. I'm a product manager at Redfin. And the job description for the role that I'm in said 2 years of experience is what they're looking for. So I had someone reach out and say, hey, Redfin's hiring. Here's this PM role, look into it. Looked at it, I was like, I don't have 2 years of experience, sorry, good luck in your search. And then, so this is someone I went to college with, and she's like, literally already talked to my manager about this. The 2 years of experience is not a strict requirement. I think you should still apply anyway. And if I was left to my own devices, I would have ignored the role altogether and blocked myself from what has now been the biggest blessing in my life. So I want to encourage other people to think about that as well. I'm not telling you to go for VP of product roles, jump from going from PM intern applications to VP of product roles. But if you see something where it's like a lot of your background is a good fit. So for example, I had my coding experience, I had design experience, I was a psychology major. There were 60% plus of the things listed that I was a really, really good fit with, and also just like the culture and all of these other factors. But that one line about needing 2 years of experience was what was going to block me. So I encourage people to think critically, like if you assess that in general, you're a good match and there's a lot of opportunity for you to be a good fit, at least put yourself in the running. It's not like applying to college where every application costs you money. So I think it's good to remember that and realize like you risk more by self-selecting out than by at least asking about certain requirements. And something that I mentioned in the book is having a plan around how you'll gain knowledge in areas that you're weak in. So for example, I work at a real estate company. I had no background in real estate before starting my job, but I made it very apparent in the interview process and throughout my discussions with people that I was willing to learn, because you're not going to have every single thing that they're looking for. And quite frankly, if you have every single thing that they're looking for, it's probably not a growth opportunity. So I don't know if I'd suggest that for you personally either. But for the things that you do feel like you're missing, let's say it's a certain tool or you need to like up your SQL knowledge or anything like that, have a plan around how you're going to increase that knowledge and make it apparent to the people who you're having these discussions with, because they'll be more willing to take someone who's a good fit and then teach them specific tools. Or if you're demonstrating that you're already trying to learn specific tools and need some more time, that's a lot better than just assuming because you don't know a very specific thing that you shouldn't be in the running at all. So before I move on, should I be looking at these chat comments?
I'd say it's up to you. They're just, you know, I think it's just everybody hanging out and enjoying ourselves.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure I didn't miss like critical questions.
No, but I would encourage folks to put questions for Phyllis in there. And what I can do is at the end, when we get to the Q&A part, we can I can kind of say them out loud to her, or you can go off mute and say it yourself as well.
Okay, works. Great. So once you've gotten into that product role or you're in a new role, how do you deal with the imposter syndrome there? Like you finally made it, you pushed past your hesitancy to self-reject for certain roles. And something that came to mind is Amy Cuddy has a TED talk about faking it till you make it. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this, I hate the advice of faking it till you make it. But the reason I hate it is actually not incongruent with anything that she says in that TED talk about building confidence. So I looked more into her background and into the TED talk and the research that she does on confidence. And what I realized is that what Amy needed was valor, not falsehood. And she eventually made it in terms of getting comfortable speaking and presenting in front of others, so much so that she went on to give a popular TED talk, not because she was fake, but because she moved toward her goals in spite of genuine fear. So I think that her TED talk is a misnomer, and it's not about faking it until you make it, but facing it until you make it, specifically in lower stakes environments. So one example of this in my role as a product manager is when I first started, as I had mentioned, I had a design background and a coding background, but not necessarily a business background. So business metrics is something that I was still getting used to. And we have a monthly product meeting, and I was so intimidated by this meeting. And the idea of ever being able to present business metrics for my team at this meeting scared me. But one of the other product managers that I was working with was like, you know what you can do is that you can start to present monthly at our team meeting instead of our whole product org. And so this wasn't me jumping straight to the monthly product meeting and pretending to know metrics that I actually haven't had time to dive into. That's not what happened. What happened was I had this fear and anxiety around these business metrics. I took the time to learn them. And then I specifically took the time to present them and to get feedback in a lower stakes, smaller environment. So presenting to 10 people instead of 100 and being able to answer questions in that environment. I think sometimes around the whole faking it until you make it advice, there's people who feel like, one, you either have to like BS entirely, which I don't think is true, or they have to ignore the fact that they're really afraid of a very certain specific circumstance and just do it anyway. I don't think either of those are necessarily true. You can acknowledge the fact that there are things that you do or don't know, but you don't have to do that at like an exec level. Like you don't need to write your CEO email and say, hey, I actually don't know what I'm doing. Sorry, thanks. But what you can do is go to your team and say, hey, these are things that I've been trying to learn more about, so I'd like to present them to you. And that's what I did with our metrics meeting with our developers, and our developers were like, I don't understand this part. And by them asking questions, I felt more equipped to learn more. And I also got practice presenting the very thing that I was afraid of before gradually stepping into a more higher stakes environment that I was initially afraid about. So it's like, you know, dipping your toe in the waters and like gradually exposing yourself to the thing that you're afraid of instead of feeling like I'm going to ignore the fact that I'm having a panic attack and just present anyway. So something that I have to admit when talking about imposter syndrome is when I decided to write this book, I was very intentional about, one, making it solution-oriented, because I hate self-help books that just make you feel great about yourself, but change nothing about anything that you're doing on a day-to-day basis. And then I also hate self-help books that don't acknowledge the realities of everyday life. And as much as I want to talk about imposter syndrome and like how you can develop confidence and get more experience with certain things and like talk to people that you don't know, I have to acknowledge that some companies and some organizations are really toxic, and they're not going to be an environment where you can just ask questions and confidently practice in a lower stakes environment. There are companies where everything is a high stakes environment. You genuinely are being judged. You actually should be afraid of being fired. And I'm not going to pretend like just asking questions and hoping for the best is going to work in that environment. So something that I talk about is testing your fear that people will judge you by asking questions early and often. I think that it's fair to be concerned and cautious in an environment that is really, really scary. Simultaneously, I do think sometimes we overestimate how scary our environment is. So for example, I mentioned the monthly product meeting, the first one that I attended. Acronyms, I love them. Our CPO was presenting and talking about IC career ladders, and I was like, I don't know what IC is. Like, what is an IC? And this was my first product meeting. And so I had two choices here. I was like, I'm just gonna act like I know what IC is, but that would have been really bad because he's about to talk about it for 30 minutes. And if I have to relearn the 30 minutes of what he's about to say because I didn't calibrate on what initially is the subject, that's gonna be a problem. And I didn't want to do that. At the same time, I was like, there's 80 people in this meeting. I'm really afraid to ask them, like, what if they all hate me and judge me? And then my manager's like, I can't believe I hired Phyllis. Why is she here? So those were the two things that I was caught between. So I just put in the little chat. I didn't unmute. I did not want to create a distraction. I was just like, what is IC in the chat? And then I received like 20 people responded immediately trying to explain what it was. And for me, that was a really good experience in terms of I had this fear that everyone was going to hate me and think that I'm stupid and ask why I'm here and like quietly ignore my question because they all knew what IC meant. But what actually happened was I put this question in the chat. Other people had the same question and everybody else was willing and ready to respond with an answer. And that showed me what kind of environment I was actually in. That was very different from what my fears are. Had that happened, and then my manager had a meeting with me later and said, Phyllis, don't embarrass me like that again. I'm not going to tell you to like have happy-go-lucky imposter syndrome, like confidence and say, just keep asking questions in the chat because you've gotten validation from your environment that actually isn't well received. So if you are in a place where people respond with support, get into a stronger practice of asking even more because you've now been shown that what you're afraid of is exactly that, a fear. Versus if you're not being supported, discern who you can go to for help. I'm sure there are people who you could like DM on Slack directly. What is an IC? Instead of asking in the whole product meeting, or if literally no one at your company, I find that hard to believe, but I'll make an edge case for it anyway. If literally no one at your company is ever willing to answer your questions, which seems very contradictory to anyone trying to grow in any role, you might have to look for a new place. And that might not be a good fit for your career development and growth, because no one knows everything and anything and everything all the time. And if that's what you're expected to do, and you're being left on your own devices to try and figure everything out for your own, then it might not be a supportive place. And then there's a very specific type of asking questions that I think is very helpful. So sometimes I would like to say there's no stupid questions, but I've recently read this book called Unspoken Rules by Njoroge. I forgot his first name, but Unspoken Rules is a book I recommend. And he talks about the fact that there are stupid questions. The stupid questions are questions that you can blatantly find easily obvious if you had just read the thing you were told to read. So in that case, you read a document, the second line in it answers what IC is. They send out an email that says, hey, everyone read this document before this meeting. If I ask what's an IC, it's like, well, Phyllis, clearly you're just not using the resources available to you. So what I think is a really important way to ask questions is to, one, do your research as much as possible and see if you can find an answer. But as I had mentioned, sometimes acronyms mean multiple things, or information is outdated, documentation is outdated. And when you ask a question to someone, present them with the homework that you basically already did, the research you already did, and say, this is what I found. These are the parts that I need clarification on. And that's very different from like, feed me information all the time because I'm unwilling to use the resources that I already have at hand, to, hey, I've tried to use the resources that I have at hand. I'm still confused about these parts. Could you please clarify? And in that case, people can see, okay, you're trying your best to learn and understand. And it also leaves less work for them if it's something that they've already pointed out. So if I were to use a LinkedIn example, people will reach out to me on LinkedIn, and then we'll have, you know, an informational interview, a coffee chat, and they'll message me and say like, hey, what do you do for work? And I'm like, this is not a good look. Like, it's in my headline, it's on my profile, and you went through the effort of like connecting with me and messaging me and asking me for a meeting, but you somehow missed something that's very apparent in a lot of places. Versus it's like, hey, I saw you're a product manager at Redfin. What is that experience like? Those are two very different questions. So even when I'm at work, similarly, whenever I start a new project, I like go through my Google Drive and try to find any document that I can find on that project. And then once I do, I'm like, these are all the questions that I have on it. Could I get your feedback on, one, who I could go to learn more about these? Because it might not necessarily be the person that I'm asking, but also two, if any of these things are outdated or I'm mistaken, could you clarify my thinking on them? So at this point, I've demonstrated the fact that I'm thinking. So it can't be like, oh, she's so stupid, we should fire her, she doesn't do anything. It's like, no, she's using her resources and our documentation's outdated, or this isn't clear enough, or this person has left the company and we need someone else to update these things. So that's a different way of asking questions, is do your research, ask for clarification on the things you've already found, versus just flying blind and hoping that everyone spoon feeds you information all the time, basically. And then once you are going through all these questions and getting answers, please document the answers for other people. It's more efficient that way if there's more documentation on the very common questions. And also, if you're a person who gets asked questions, which is something I'm going to do even with this talk, note what the questions were and what the answers are, because future people will probably have that question too. So for example, our CPO presented this whole deck, had IC written all over the deck, but nothing about what IC was. A very simple change is changing the name of the deck to actually spell out what IC is, and then the rest of the deck, it would have been already clear from slide one what it is. So when you learn something new, please contribute that information to other people so that they can learn as well. I'm gonna pause again. Are there like urgent questions?
There's a couple questions in the chat. One is from Gunay. It says, how do you manage imposter syndrome when this is an interesting one, actually, for me personally, because I've had a lot of experience with internal products. How do you manage imposter syndrome when you are looking for a PM job, but you only have experience building an internal product? I noticed interviewers are often not interested in once they know you build internal tools. It's kind of a specific tactical question, but I think a lot of people probably have that question.
So in this case, someone's looking for already is a PM on internal tools, or I guess I'm confused on what their capacity of work with internal tools is currently.
Yeah, that's a good question. Gunay, do you want to, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but if you want to give Phyllis some details or elaborate, you're welcome to.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Thank you, Phyllis. Yes. So I'm a PM doing building an internal product. So I was curious, like how to, currently struggling actually, because I'm noticing companies are often not interested or looking for PM specifically with not with specific experience and not for internal tooling, So I'm curious, yeah, what would you suggest?
Yeah, so in this case, you're a PM for internal tools looking for new PM roles. It sounds like the new PM roles are not internal tools, and therefore recruiters and hiring managers don't feel like you're a good match.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Well, for one, I would say like you're already a PM. That's amazing. I think sometimes people can hyper differentiate behind like different types of PM. I mean, I've been a PM on internal tools and consumer facing, and I understand that there are differences, but this is a very different question from I don't have product experience at all. How do I think about imposter syndrome? So in this case, you already have this experience. And when I hear people who already have experience struggling, I think one of two things. And one being, there are places that are going to specifically look for consumer side facing like hyper growth hacking PMs. And if you didn't do that, then they're just not going to hire you. And that's not representative on your skill as a PM. That's just not a fit for what they're looking for at that time. And so that's the first thing. There are going to be places where it's not a fit. The second thing that I think of is you actually might be a fit, and it's more about positioning and storytelling around your current experience. Because I think sometimes people over rely on hiring managers or recruiters or sourcers specifically to be able to infer the ways in which you are a fit. So for example, someone's like, I'm a PM for internal tools. These are all the changes I made. And what they're looking for is like, this many customers grew and like this much revenue grew. And then they look at your resume and they're like, I don't see it. You must not be a good fit for the job, but actually you have really great skills that are super applicable. It becomes a thing of how you're positioning the language around your current experience. And that's its own can of worms, but I wouldn't say that you're necessarily not a fit for everything. I will acknowledge that there are things that you're not going to be a fit for, but it becomes a thing of, I have very relevant skills, very relevant experience. Other people are struggling to piece that together and infer where that connection lies. How can I use the language to describe my current experience better so that they can clearly see where the match aligns? Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you very much.
There, can do one more and then move on. And then we're at the end, because the only thing that's left is managers.
Let's see here. I saw one more in here, but now I have to go back up through here. Let's see. Isn't this, oh no, that's not it.
Okay.
Oh, here it is. Thank you. I saw yesterday on Twitter that someone posted that imposter syndrome is sometimes rooted in a lack of self-worth. Do you have any thoughts on cultivating your internal sense of worthiness? Oh, that's an interesting one.
That's so heavy. That's so heavy. So this is the one part. I tried as much as possible to put everything in the book, but this is the one thing I left out. I do not acknowledge in the book that there is a lot of non-environmental factors and like historical background factors in someone's mental health and like emotions and interpersonal relationships that are going to play a part in imposter syndrome. So myself, I have experienced imposter syndrome. I also have been diagnosed with anxiety. Those things are not unrelated at all. However, unpacking how to piece apart imposter syndrome from having anxiety, for example, or struggling with self-worth or being depressed, all of which that I have experience with, is not something that I can cover in a self-help book. Like, that's going to be continuous work that, I mean, I've benefited from a therapist. I suggest finding a great therapist if you can. But in terms of self-worth is very, this is really a large can of worms, but self-worth is rooted in our experiences with people, right? Like, I think when we're born, we have a pretty strong sense of self-worth. Like, I've never seen a baby come out of the womb and be like, damn, my life sucks. Like, I'm a terrible person. These are learned beliefs. Like, whether we have positive beliefs about ourselves or negative beliefs about ourselves, we've learned them from other people in our environment. And unpacking who put these thoughts in our head that we're not worthy, or that we lack worth, or that we have to do more to finally be worthy enough of something, is one section of work. And then another section of work is, once you've unpacked like who those people are, thinking through like, how do those people still matter to me? So for example, I have a lot of trauma with my family, and I literally just had to disconnect from my family because there was no way for me to continue to try and say that I have like this strong self-worth while being surrounded by people who continue to reaffirm a different belief. So in this case, your environment does matter, and the types of people that you're around do matter. And I actually talked about this in chapter 1, where when thinking about your strengths and weaknesses, think about the people in your environment who see your strengths and how they can continue to remind you of that and affirm that for you, especially if you're struggling to do that yourself. So on the other hand, if you're in an environment where people continue to not affirm you and continue to deny your self-worth, there's a lot of things to think about in terms of, should I stay in this environment? Am I capable of staying in this environment? And what about this environment needs to change? So it's like unpacking where this came from. Once you know where it came from, what are you going to do about it? And then the last part is realizing like, you have a lot of worth as is. Like, there's nothing more that you need to do. If you never become a PM, if you never work another day in your life, if you never get a promotion, if you never move up the career ladder, if you never post a piece on LinkedIn, if a recruiter never reaches out to you, like, you still have inherently, I believe, worth as a human being, and that's not going to be tied to your productivity. So it's a heavy question with a lot of parts, but I would say the work of unpacking where the feelings of unworthiness come from is literally work, and like continuous work that would have to happen in parallel to trying to overcome and grow through and move through imposter syndrome.
Great advice.
Okay. On that note, I'm going to move on to you talking about managing imposter syndrome in your reports. So as a manager, I think I've never been a manager, but I have expectations of my manager and the managers in the world to be helpful resources for their reports. And that includes dealing with imposter syndrome, because imposter syndrome is going to be something that affects someone's career growth and their development and their movement, which is something that is important to you, I hope, as their manager. So for one, clarifying that expectations are high with good reason. So my manager did this really well when I started. She said, like, I am going to have very high expectations of you. And that's because I believe in your growth and your potential to meet them. It's not arbitrary, like, here are high expectations, and if you don't meet them, I'm firing you. It's like, these are the expectations that I'm setting because I see your ability to meet them. So someone might see a situation as, I'm inadequate because I missed the mark. But as a manager, if you're clear that the critical input in an assessment of opportunity is for refinement rather than you are great or I'm firing you, that's very different. So thinking of that and making sure that it's clear that it's not an indictment for where someone has floundered entirely. So right now, when I'm thinking about, I actually had this conversation, I was on vacation last week. The Friday before I went on vacation, I had a very, very real conversation with my manager, because this is exactly how I felt. I was like, oh my God, you're gonna fire me. Like, I'm trash at my job. I'm a terrible human being. Like, how dare I post on LinkedIn about product management? I can't even do my job as a product manager. And we had to have a really open conversation around what exactly are your expectations of me, and like, how am I meeting them or not meeting them? And the reason that had been so stressed is that I didn't realize that there are things that she was presenting me to do in order to grow in my skill, not because if I didn't do them, she would fire me. And I had this misperception that, oh, she wants me to demonstrate this certain skill, and if I don't, I'm fired tomorrow, basically. And I was getting very afraid of that. And I'm like, I haven't shown you this yet, and I'm still working on it. And she's like, I'm not worried about this. Like, this is just advice for you to grow as a person, versus me thinking, oh, this is a thing I have to do or else I'm fired. So as a manager, being extremely clear on, these are the things that I think you can grow into. These are the things that I'm expecting of you right now. And that can make someone feel like, okay, I may not be doing these things yet, but they're expected of me at this time or at this level, versus I'm not doing these things yet, and that means I shouldn't be a product manager, or you're going to fire me and I'm a terrible person who doesn't know how to do my job. So please clarify with your reports, if you have them, on exactly what your expectations are and what success, classic PM question, what does success look like? So in this case, when you're thinking about something like leadership, so in our career calibration ladder, we have leadership as one of the things that you're evaluated on. Communication, design thinking, etc. These are relatively obscure terms. Like, what does that look like? If I say red apple, I think we all saw what that looked like. If I say design thinking, what is it? What is that? So when we're thinking about mentees or reports or anyone like that, what exactly is good leadership and communication to you? There's actually research that's been done on this, that very highly qualified graduate students will get hired into like top firms. And there are all these expectations that they're going to be top performers because they did so great in school. And companies fight really hard to get the people who are in the research study to work at their firm. And they followed up with people, and they found that a not insignificant portion of them were getting fired. And so the researchers looked into, why is this happening? How could this possibly be happening? They're top performers. Why are they getting fired? And what they discovered is that these people were actually performing really well at the thing they thought they were supposed to be doing, but they weren't performing well at the thing that their manager thought they were supposed to be doing. So they got fired for not doing their job, but actually there was a discrepancy between what expectations were set up front and the performance that aligned with that, versus the expectations at present and the performance that aligned with that. So people who tend to be the least anxious about a big meeting or promotion are those who can evaluate themselves realistically without relying too much on praise or criticism from others. So if you say you want someone to be a better communicator, and then they start writing the world's best emails, but then you come back to them in their check-in and say, I still don't think you're a great communicator, they're going to be blindsided because they improved so much. But actually what you meant is, I wanted you to be a good communicator by providing Slack updates on a more frequent basis. But you didn't define granularly, what does it look like to be better? And then the last part is praise process over outcomes. So in the book, I talk about the fact that 6 studies by Carol Dweck, who does research on growth mindset, demonstrated that praise for intelligence had more negative consequences for students' achievement than praise for effort. So when you think about, there are a lot of factors that contribute to whether any A/B test or rollout or anything that you work on is going to be successful or not, things that you're going to be completely blindsided by. For example, COVID. There are a lot of companies that were negatively affected by that, not because their PMs chose the wrong feature to work on, but because the whole market was in shambles, and to a degree now is still in shambles. But when you think about complimenting someone or encouraging someone, saying, you're doing really well in your process in these ways. I can see that you're organizing these meetings in this way, and you provide these updates, and your relationship with the developers have improved by this manner, versus you move the metric 2%, great. Because when you do the latter, the next time that person doesn't do that, they're going to think I'm terrible. Like, I'm terrible, I didn't do my job, I'm not performing. But to be honest, maybe the metric didn't move because of a lot of external reasons, but their process and their diligence and their effort and their work is actually still just as good, or has even improved. But when you miss encouraging someone based off of that, they're going to internalize it and feel like, because I didn't reach this external outcome, my internal performance and worth in my job is also a failure. So now that we've gotten that all out of the way, I want to say thank you again. And there's 99 messages in the chat. I'm afraid to open it, so I'm going to rely on you to relay questions.
What questions do you guys have in there? Isaac says it's 100 messages now. That's right. I actually have a question for you. I'm interested to know, this is for me personally, on sort of this, I really love this slide about how to manage imposter syndrome in your direct reports, but also, or like your team. I think that's probably also true of your peers too, and like just your friends or like the people that you work with that you don't want to have this feeling, and you kind of feel like maybe they do feel this way. So I'm interested, like more specifically, less about like your direct reports, but more about like other people. How do you identify that other people are feeling imposter syndrome in a particular time or moment, and how can you help?
I think there's a lot of different ways it comes out in. So first of all, a lot of people aren't even going to know what imposter syndrome is. They're not just going to say like, hey, Phyllis, guess what? I have imposter syndrome. Can you help me? That's not what that looks like. Sometimes it does, but often it doesn't look like that. It looks like, I've been trying to get a PM role for a year. I don't think I'm going to get into it. So I'm just going to focus on doing something else entirely. And I think I'm going to go back to school and get coding bootcamp and become a software engineer. And then I'll ask them, like, do you like software engineering? And they're like, no, but I can't be a PM. Like, that's a very subtle message of, hey, this is imposter syndrome and this person feeling like I'm not qualified for this, even though it's something that I want. Or even just thinking about like when you compliment someone. I think compliments are actually where it comes out the most. When you compliment someone and they immediately deny it and point you to some alternative evidence of why the compliment is not worth what you think it is, I think that becomes a strong indicator. So it's like, Phyllis, I think you did a great job of that talk. I'm like, oh, well, you know, like the slides weren't working in the beginning, or like I actually forgot this whole piece that I meant to put in at the end, etc. To there's a deflection there because they're not identifying with the praise and achievement that you are giving to them. So I think it's kind of just listening for the ways in which either someone sounds really discouraged about their performance and they've moved away from feeling a personal responsibility for like, how can I grow and get better so that I can achieve this thing that I want, to saying, this thing is just not for me. So like, it sounds like that. And then it also sounds like compliments and praise that are immediately deflected and denied because a person doesn't identify with whatever you're saying about their achievement. So in terms of how to help, do not, there's so many things that people do that I'm going to tell you not to do. Do not immediately be like, no, actually, you're pretty great. Like, I don't understand why you're worried. Like, you're amazing. That actually doesn't really do anything for people long term. It's just like, I don't know if you've seen that meme of someone who, there's like a large gaping flood and someone just like takes like a little sticky sheet of paper to like cover it up. Obviously, it's going to erupt again. And that's kind of what happens when we try to give these blanket terms of encouragement to people and not address how they're feeling about something. So what I try to do when people say something to me that I'm like, I don't know about that, is not just say like, actually you did great, there's nothing for you to be worried about, like whatever. I instead try to actually walk them through their own thought process. You'd be surprised, if you have time to do this, you'd be surprised how much people realize about themselves by saying it out loud as you ask questions. So for example, if you give this compliment like, the talk was amazing, great job, and I'm like, no, it was terrible. I'd be like, interesting. So there's two options. You can be like, no, it was amazing. I don't know why you think it's terrible. What's wrong with you? It was great. That's not helping anyone. Or you can be like, why do you think it was terrible? I was like, well, this thing happened and I was worried about that and I forgot this piece. And then I'll be like, oh, well, actually, it's me that you're talking to. So you'll be like, you would say to me in this case, like, I understand that you're concerned about these things, but here's, I don't know, 3 people in the survey actually said that these parts of your talk were really impactful for them. And everyone doesn't even know that you meant to mention that slide and forgot about it, and they still gained the benefit of your talk. I'm like, yeah, I guess they did, but they would have gained even more benefit if I had remembered that one slide. And it's like, well, that's great. We can send out the slide to everyone who said that they're attending. And now it's like, yeah, you're right. And then you can encourage me and say, I really think it was a great talk and it had the impact that you wanted. And we're still going to be able to have even more impact because now we can send out the slide. And then I'm going to feel a lot better about that. Or if I'm thinking about my friend who's like, I've been applying to product roles for a year, I'm going to give up and become a software engineer, even though I don't want to do that. Like, interesting, like what makes you feel that way? Because sometimes people know things that you don't know about them. So I'm going to say, like, what makes you think that going down that route is going to be any easier than unpacking? Well, I talked to this person at Amazon and they said that I needed a technical background and I didn't have a technical background. And I'm like, what exactly does a technical background mean? And like, well, I don't know. I never asked them. And I was like, you should ask them. And they're like, okay, fine. And then they go to sourcers or recruiters or whatever, and they ask, hey, you keep saying that I need a technical background and I don't have it. How can I demonstrate a technical background? And then the person's like, oh, I think you'd have a technical background if you like demonstrated more knowledge with analytical tools, etc. And then they'll come back to me and say, I can't believe I was going to become a software engineer when what I really needed to do was learn APIs and Tableau, which is very different because coding bootcamps are like 20 grand. So you really just save this person a lot. So I think it's not about just giving blanket encouragement, because that actually doesn't like deeply set in with people, but kind of going through their thought process with them and saying like, these are the reasons that you feel a certain way. How can I provide actual solutions to that? And how can I make you realize that the goal that you have for yourself, you're still achieving despite the way that you feel currently. So what someone said to me recently, they had asked me like, I don't feel like I have enough experience to do, I forgot what it was. They were asking for a specific role and I was like, oh, okay, cool. At what point will you feel like you have enough experience? Because they were trying to continue building UX designer who's continuing to build their portfolio. And they're like, I don't feel like I have enough projects. And I was like, what? At what point, like, what is your definition of enough projects? And they realize like, I don't have a definition of enough. And I'm like, so that means you'll perpetually never feel like you have enough. And they're like, that makes sense. So I said, hey, let's talk to some people and figure out how many projects people actually look at and people actually need. And then that will be your criterion. Once you hit that, you're allowed to be confident in your ability to apply for stuff, which is a much more helpful thought than saying like, no, your work is great, just keep applying, versus getting real serious feedback that this is how much is enough. Once you've met that bar, you're not allowed to move it again. We're going to celebrate when you meet this bar.
Yeah, I think that's particularly true now when people are really looking to hire, right? If you in product management particularly, there's a lot of hiring going on, and I think if you can demonstrate that you are really want to show that you can meet those bars, and hey, explain to me exactly what that thing is so I can jump over it, like that means a lot, you know. Anybody else on the phone have any questions for oh, I see a hand, there's a hand up somewhere.
Oh, it's me. Hi, I'm Jensine. Thank you so much, Phyllis, for this wonderful presentation. My question is about like the practices of trying to grow through imposter syndrome. So you spoke a lot about mind framing and, you know, undergoing self-assessment, but I'm curious to know, are there any practices that you engage in daily to grow with imposter syndrome that we can apply like tomorrow?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So the thing that I just mentioned is actually something I do a lot with myself, which is I ask myself, what is enough? Because a lot of imposter syndrome is like, I don't have enough experience, I don't have enough confidence, I don't have enough material, I don't have enough skill in this category. And then it becomes like this perpetual wheel of like never feeling like enough, but then you actually get more experience and then it still doesn't feel like enough. So I try very hard on a continual basis whenever I'm thinking about something to define what exactly is enough. So for example, with this book, I experienced imposter syndrome while writing the book, which was hilarious. And I had to like reread my own chapters, which was also hilarious. But part of it was people would ask me, they're like, oh, so you're an author, oh, you're a writer. And I never changed my LinkedIn headline, even though I was writing the book. And I was like, no, like I don't identify with those terms. And then I had to ask myself, like, what is the criteria? At what point am I a writer? At what point am I an author? At what point am I a content creator or a speaker or whatever? Is it audience size? Is it when I've posted, etc. And then I decided once I finished the first draft, I was willing to call myself a writer because I wrote something, versus there are people in my position right now, because I went through the program with other people who still won't call themselves like a writer or an author or whatever, because they haven't defined with themselves what's enough. Is it when you hit like a New York Times bestseller category? Is it when you hit Amazon bestseller? It's when 1,000 people have bought it, whatever. Versus my definition was once I finished writing the first draft, I became a writer. And we don't all have to have the same definitions, but it's clear, it's really helpful for you to be clear with yourself. What is your definition? So that you're not like perpetually chasing this like externally moving goalpost around when you'll finally not feel like an imposter.
Thank you so much for your answer.
Great question. I really like that one. Anybody else out there?
I do enjoy how you mentioned like moving the goalpost. Like that is like the epitome of like imposter syndrome, knowing that there's this expectation that you are consistently trying to reach for, but then someone moves it and says, hey, actually, let's go left or let's go right. And so when that happens, I think it's like this construct in my mind where I have to redefine all over again and break down to a smaller form what is enough to me. Mm-hmm. And am I even going in the right direction because someone else, whether it was a mentor or someone, you know, in your colleague space or what have you, moved it because you were so unsure of yourself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really hard when other people move the goalpost as well. And that kind of ties into the job description thing. Every job description is a moving goalpost. One's 6 years of experience, one's 4 years of experience, one's CS degree required, one's MBA required. So if you don't define for yourself like when you're going to feel ready for something or when you're going to feel confident in something or when you're going to feel skilled, you're leaving it up to other people. And there's a lot of people out there, which means you're never actually going to get a clear definition. Other questions?
Yeah, Phyllis, I think one question I had is if I'm a product owner at a company with, you know, it's a mature company in a lot of respects, but the product team's very young, and I don't really have like a lot of maybe mentors or people with a lot of best practice experiences. What would be your advice for someone struggling with imposter syndrome on that front potentially?
So you're struggling because you don't have mentors that work on your direct team, or what do you feel like is the cause of that?
I guess the product team at my org is just extremely young, right? So maybe not someone with a lot of experience above me. Is it leveraging an external mentor or, you know, best practices in the industry? I guess I'm kind of looking for. Yeah, so if in the case that you're feeling like you're new and on a new-ish team, I would 100%, actually, even if you're literally the director of product at Google, I 100% advocate for finding mentors in and outside of your organization. I think LinkedIn's a really useful place for finding different people. One, because I was talking to one of my design partners about this today. Organizations have their own bias to the things that they know, their methods, et cetera. And even if you get strongly mentored by someone in your own organization, that's only one way to do things. There are a lot of ways and a lot of perspectives on this product work, especially, and thinking about how you can reach out to people at different product orgs and at different levels of seniority to get mentored by them. And I want to take a moment to talk about like what exactly is mentoring. Sometimes people DM me and they're like, hey, can you be my mentor? And I'm like, I don't know what this means. I don't know how I'm supposed to help you. I find that mentoring happens by having questions for people prepared, having a meeting with them or email or message or whatever. They answer those questions. And then you go back and tell them, hey, this is how I applied your advice. And here are some more questions. And over time, that just develops into a mentoring relationship because someone can mentor you one-off or on a continual basis, informally or formally. And all that really looks like is there are things I want to learn. You have more knowledge in this area or experience in this area. I would like to learn that from you. So thinking about what are things that you're going through at work right now that you feel like other people around are not equipped to support you in or answer questions about, or even if they are, just we want different perspectives on, and have a very specific question to go ask other people. So for example, I
I'm actually I have a lot of PM mentors that I'm very grateful for. And what that looks like is any week that I'm having a struggle at work, I just ask this question of all my mentors. So for example, recently I got feedback that a lot of the people a lot of people that I'm working with feel out of the loop with stuff, but I was confused because these are people who like aren't even relevant to a given project. So it's like, how can you feel out of the loop if this isn't even your project? What's the loop that you feel outside of? So I was struggling with this. I was like, I don't want to blast a bunch of Slack channels and email threads with updates that aren't important to a broader public because one or two people just want to know everything all the time. But at the same time, how do I not miss out on people? So this is a very specific scenario, and I just messaged other PMs, more senior PMs, directors, etc. And I'm like, hey, this is this thing that I'm struggling at work with. I don't want to over communicate irrelevant updates to a bunch of parties, but also I want to be calculated in a way that doesn't make people feel like they're not being looped in on things that they want to be a part of. How have you managed this at your organization? Now all these people who answer my question have informally become my mentors. I tell them how it worked, and now we develop a mentoring relationship. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, that was honestly a perfect answer. So I really appreciate it.
Okay, great.
Yeah, thank you so much.
That was a really good one. Anybody else? Phyllis, I don't think you're the person to answer this for me, but someday somebody's gonna have to tell me how to get mentors when you're old, like me. It's easy to get, well, I don't know, easy, but I feel like when you're younger, everybody wants to help you, but when you're old, everybody thinks you already probably ought to, know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting dynamic that I've found with people that so I have people that I mentor who are more experienced than I am. And I found that something that they've brought up to me is because they're more experienced, people don't want to tell them anything because they assume they already know things. And then it becomes this interesting dynamic of people trying to prove how smart they are to the person they're supposed to be mentoring versus like just having an open and honest discussion. So I'm not sure. People have their own biases in terms of the people that they meet and how they treat them, but I'm always happy to answer questions if you have.
Fair enough. I may or may not be asking that question, not just for me, but for all the other old people that need mentors. But also for me.
Jantine.
Yeah, you touched a lot about mentorships. I wanted to use this time to ask the question regarding mentorship. So I'm like on LinkedIn specifically, I'm struggling with building that genuine relationship with someone to enter the mentorship phase. And I know you said ask like questions and stuff, but sometimes people don't respond. So how do you begin to gain that person's trust? Because as someone that's really trying to enter a new field in a new space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that can be tough. One, because there's like 15 people that everybody asks the same questions of, and they're just flooded with questions and comments, etc. So that becomes really hard in terms of getting a response back. I will say a good majority of them are not intentionally ignoring you, that they're just flooded with inbox requests. But one, in that related vein, follow up with people. I was just on vacation for 9 days. My LinkedIn was a mess last night. And it wasn't because these people messaged me and I hate them and I never want to talk to them and I can't believe they reached out to me. It's like, actually, I was just on vacation and it came back to 50 messages at the same time that were like paragraphs. And I was like, I just can't respond to this on a Sunday night. I'm sorry. You're going to get back from me a week from now. So follow up with people because you're going to like rise back to the top of their inbox. People talk about this in terms of like job applications too. They're like, reach out to recruiters 7 a.m. on a Monday. So it's the first thing they see. Don't apply a Saturday at 11 p.m. And this is like valid advice because inboxes get pretty full. So follow up people so you keep rising to the top. So there's that. And then the other part is like, how do you show that you're genuine? That is important because there are people who are really just jerks. Like they'll message you and be like, give me a referral. And I'm like, hi, how are you? Like, is there something I can help with? And they're like, refer me. And I'm like, okay. sure, or is there a role you're interested in? And they're like, I just like DoorDash. And I'm like, I don't even work at DoorDash. So there is actually a very strong need to build trust with people, because sometimes there's a lot of people who are just spreading out messages, and we're not going to give equal time to everyone who reaches out. And one way that I'll do that is, if people have content, like genuinely engage with their content. You can't follow that all the time, but if you leave like genuine comments, that means I show up to you and I mean something to you more than a referral. And also think about the fact that a lot of relationships are about mutual benefit. People don't post content just so for it to go in a void. They want to help you. And if you say, and that actually, content in and of itself is a form of mentorship. A lot of things that I answer personally, one-on-one, a lot of the things that I've answered in this talk, I will post as content, and that becomes a form of mentorship. So even if you can't follow up with the person directly, you can follow up their content to show like, I'm listening to the things that you're saying. These things have been helpful to me. I hope we can talk one day. I don't know if you know Felix Watson, but that's what I did. I just like followed his content for a really long time, and I commented on it, and I was like, all of this is super helpful. And now we like talk like every 2 weeks, which is amazing. So engaging with people's content, and then following up, then engaging with people's content. And then the last part is what I had mentioned previously about how you structure questions. Like, are you demonstrating that I've done some research, I've done some background, I saw you wrote this Medium article, I really appreciated it, I have some follow-up questions about the things that you had mentioned, versus, hi Phyllis. I'm probably not going to respond to that. But if someone says, I read this article and I thought this was helpful, but I'm confused on this piece, I'm much more inclined, because you've shown that this is like something that genuinely matters enough to you for you to seek out your own resources, but also genuinely matters in the specific context of me, and I'm the person who needs to respond to you because you need my help, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Was that helpful? Your
No,
thing
no,
feels
it was, especially especially the engagement part. That was really helpful. Just, you know, being more open to engaging with other people's posts. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I'll just remind you that sometimes people not responding isn't personal, and following up is super helpful. And also just having like targeted engagement and very specific questions. Make it, on the note of people being really busy, make it easy for them to answer your question quickly. So if the question of like, how do I get into product is a really broad question, versus I saw you posted this thing about doing informational interviews by reaching out to people who say they're hiring in their LinkedIn headline. How did you search for that? And then I'm like, oh, that's a very specific question. I'll respond to you pretty quick.
Thank you.
Great advice. I like the tactical advice, and I think those are really good ones. The one that has worked for me is being annoying. From my perspective, annoying, which is to say, like, you follow up with people even if they haven't responded or don't seem interested. That works really, really well after like the 5th time. So thank you. Anybody else have any questions for Phyllis?
Phyllis, I have a question.
Yes.
So I guess when it comes to being a PM in tech, we have to work with engineering teams heavily. So what did you do to kind of, I guess, reduce that, that kind of like knowledge gap and imposter syndrome that came with not knowing, how maybe the engineering process worked or all those different tech acronyms? What steps did you take to kind of improve upon that?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. And the engineering and PM relationship is what scares a lot of people who don't have a technical background when they're becoming PMs. I would say, for one, again, these are human beings. So setting up my immediate priority was setting up one-on-ones with anyone on the engineering team that I was going to work with, and building a human relationship first before I built any type of work transactional relationship. And that's really helpful because asking questions is going to be really important. And I think I'm not the only one who feels like asking a question to someone that who you think is friendly, is much easier to asking a question to a random Slack profile that you've never spoken to before, and fearing what kind of judgment would come with that. So kind of building a human relationship so you're less intimidated to ask questions in the first place. And then another thing that I'd mentioned is seeking out all the resources you can. before like taking up a developer's time. So I asked the engineering manager, I'm like, how can I learn about our engineering process and the tools that we use? And also thinking about asking questions that are about process efficiency versus any specific project. So for example, something that I might ask is, actually, I'll literally just give you the example that I had. I had a meeting before this, and our engineers are working on experiment cleanup, but they're never getting enough time to work on experiment cleanup. And rather than like asking like, how does this like very specific experiment cleanup work? I'm like, I can see that we need to work on experiment cleanup. What's your process for working on that? And like, how can I make that better? And that does two things, because you end up learning about the process in that way, but you also learn about it in a way that in turn helps both them and you. So thinking about how you can improve processes, and in that case, end up learning about the processes in the process, I find super helpful. And then also shadowing a lot of meetings. So for example, I recently got added to our dev working session. I'm in the product working session because I'm a PM, but I didn't know we also have a dev working session. And now I get to like see demos of the things that we're working on and be able to hear other people's questions about them. And that becomes an efficiency thing, because taking up developers' time one-on-one versus they're already going to be demoing something, or they're already going to be having Q&A time or working session around something, just shadow those meetings and just end up absorbing a lot more in that way, rather than like pinging one off. Like, I saw this thing, like, what does that mean? What does that mean? So anyway, to recap all of that, human relationships first. It's easier to ask questions of people that you like kind of know versus like a floating profile head. And then use the resources that you can find as much as possible and ask people for those resources so that you can learn as much as possible on your own, and then ask clarifying questions. And then also think about process efficiency, learn about processes while trying to make them better, because that also shifts how you think about it. Instead of thinking of it as, this is how this works today, it's like, this is how this works today, and this is what could be improved about it, which like to me creates a deeper sense of learning. And then the last piece is shadow all the meetings that are already happening where things are getting explained, so that you don't have to take up even more time trying to learn something one-off.
Here's some beautiful singing. Sometimes I feel like singing when you're on our product tank too, Phyllis. Anybody else? We have time for one more question, I think. Anybody have one more? That was a good one, Johnny. Thank you for that.
Just as a follow-up, Phyllis, when you say process efficiency, is that specific to your company, or is that, you think it's across the board, just for the engineering and PM relationship?
On a related note, I'll be careful about asking questions that don't result in any changes on your end or on their end.
Okay.
That becomes asking questions just to ask questions. So for example, like GraphQL, like I know our developers are working with GraphQL. I'm not going to ask them all the details of that just so it's like bonding time. Like, it's like, if nothing changes about how I use it or you use it, I won't ask. But when I say process efficiency, I'm thinking about things like, for example, when we're talking about experiment cleanup, that applies to me, because how fast we clean up experiments changes how fast I can continue to write requirements so that we can build newer experiences. So it's just like, when anyone's working on something, I try to think of, instead of asking a question about the specific thing that they're working on, I don't want to talk in abstracts because that's confusing. So we're optimizing a part of our flow, and we have to change something from a modal to like on screen. And instead of asking about, how do you change this modal from this modal to this piece being on screen, because that's very narrow and granular, I would ask something along the lines of like, how is this entire code base, like how is this area of the code affected by the changes that we're making, and how do you approach different parts of these changes? And that also informs how I write future iterations of changes to this entire code base, rather than, I learned about how this one specific piece works, and then when I don't need that specific piece anymore, that information became irrelevant. So it's just like asking how questions gets at the process piece.
Right. That question relates to the actual code, which does relate to the process efficiency.
So yeah, I would just ask more things along the lines of, instead of like, what is this thing and what are you working on? And like, what are you changing? Because what are you changing is very specific versus like, now that you've seen this, how does that affect how you're thinking about this area? And how do you think about implementing these changes? Because how they think about implementing this set of changes is probably not that different from how they're going to start the process they use to think about implementing other changes.
Okay, that's clear. Thank you.
Well, it is somehow we've gotten all the way to 5:27. Phyllis, what a pleasure having you here. I can tell you from just having done a lot of these events, usually by the Q&A session, you see a lot of people drop off, and we have really great retention and tons of great questions. I personally loved it. And I can think of a few things that I'm going to take away. I recommend everybody buy the book. And I think you'll really love it. I'll put in one more plug for our upcoming product conference. It'll be in June in Richmond, for those of you that want it. Phyllis, any final thoughts to leave the group with other than, my last thought to you is thank you very much for coming and talking to us about this. This is really terrific.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for having me. I was super excited when you reached out, and I think that this is a great opportunity for me and for the audience. In terms of final thoughts, I would say the theme that I heard in the things that I said today were asking yourself what exactly something is defined as, whether that means asking yourself what your reports, success, what it looks like to be a good communicator, what it looks like for you to finally feel confident enough to get a new role in product, what it looks like for people at work to be supportive of you. Like what does that definition look like? And then following that versus having moving goalpost. So what is enough is the overarching question behind imposter syndrome. What is finally enough? And I would love for anyone and everyone to connect with me on LinkedIn if they have follow-up questions later on too.
All right, everybody. Phyllis, thanks so much. Everybody out there in the Product Tank community, thanks for joining us. What a pleasure to see you all. Connect with everybody on LinkedIn. That's what they're there for, right? Thanks a lot. Have a great evening.
Thanks, y'all.
Everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Great.